Hello and welcome to a special ITV News digital debate. Tonight we have gathered a panel of guests from around the world who will explore how smartphones and social media in general are revolutionizing our understanding of journalism.
Something just blew up!
A barbaric terror attack in broad daylight. A British soldier is murdered on the streets of London. With bloodied hands, one of the killers boasted on camera moments after the attack.
That's not now, you need to come. You need to come.
His arrest for speeding was captured on video. 4 officers stun King with a laser gun, then beat and kick him repeatedly.
I got 12 of my family dead.
Earlier, more than 30 shops were smashed. This, a sweet shop.
Whoa! Captured on a mobile phone camera, gunfire on campus that seems as if it will never end.
One of the survivors took these pictures with the camera in her mobile phone.
Look at this. Oh, God.
Well, there we are, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much indeed. A warm welcome to those of you here in London and around the world watching online. I'm Mark Austin, and this is an ITV News special digital debate brought to you in partnership with Intelligence Squared and Google. Now, it's difficult to get away from cameras these days, from the surveillance cameras on the street that film our every move to these smartphones in our pockets. But how many of us use those devices for more than snapping the odd selfie or boring our friends with our holiday pictures? Almost a year ago, a young British soldier was murdered in London on a street in broad daylight. The killer was filmed by an ordinary bystander using his mobile phone as the killer explained why he had carried out the brutal attack. The footage was used on ITV News that night. In the Middle East, in Syria and in Egypt, smartphones are being used to expose atrocities and in so doing shape world opinion. And these cameras are being used in areas by and large where the mainstream media can't reach, helping to provide a voice for those who cannot normally be heard. Smartphones, together with all the other kinds of social media, have made all of us much more powerful and better informed as citizens. But with that power, of course, comes a responsibility. Should we always believe what we see if we don't know who's operating the camera or where it was filmed or when it was filmed? Is this new breed of so-called citizen journalism playing an important role in delivering news or helping us deliver news, or is it simply distorting our understanding of world events? And what does the mainstream media need to learn from all this? What do we need to carefully consider when it comes to broadcasting largely unfiltered and potentially provocative material? Well, without further delay, let me introduce the panelists. To my right, we have the author and journalist Will Self. We also have the renowned war photographer Paul Conroy, who was seriously injured in the Syrian city of Homs in the same attack in which the Sunday Times journalist Marie Colvin, a great friend to some of us here, was killed. To my left, Oren Yakovovich, founder of Videre, a human rights group that works to expose violations of human rights around the globe largely through secret and covert filming. And also, to his left, the renowned libertarian writer and director of Britain's Institute of Ideas and star of Moral Maze and All Things on Radio 4, Claire Fox. Now, joining us on Google Hangout is from New York, the filmmaker and Vice News reporter Simon Ostrovsky, who we are very lucky to have. He was recently held captive for 3 days by pro-Russia separatists in eastern Ukraine. We're also hoping, I should point out, to make contact with Jessica Mabry, the founder of Video Volunteers, which is an organization which brings journalism training to some of India's poorest communities. Ladies and gentlemen, our panel. Now, you don't just have to be in this room. Wherever you are, you can put questions to the speakers. For those of you watching online, we have our web host, Charlene White. Charlie.
Thanks very much, Mark. Yes, we do want to make sure that you guys get involved in the discussion here. Just because you're not physically here in London doesn't mean that you can't post your question to the panel and take part in the debate genuinely, actually. We're using the hashtag IQ2News. That's IQ2News. And for those of you who are in the audience, you will be seeing that flash up every now and then up on the screens in here. So if you're on Twitter, if you're on Facebook, make sure you go to the Intelligence Squared Facebook page. Also go to the Google Plus page as well, where we do have an online debate happening there too. So make sure you do get your questions in. Lots of you have already taken part in the debate, and I will be putting those questions to our panel a little bit later on. So just to reiterate, the hashtag is hashtag IQ2News. Mark.
Okay, thanks, Charlene. Now, to kick off, I think it would be useful to give our panelists a minute or so just to set out their views on citizen journalism. We can start with Oren. And how would you define citizen journalism, first of all, and how useful is it today?
I guess very useful. So what we're seeing is a phenomenon or a trend that's happening in the last years where citizens have cameras, thanks to technology development. And what we're seeing is a lot of images that we usually can't see through traditional media. And it's basically tackling two things that are problematic with traditional media. First thing, journalists cannot be everywhere, and we all know that they're all going bankrupt now, so they have less and less journalists all over. And second of all, they cannot be on the ground all the time, giving an ongoing account about what's really happening. And this can be solved with citizen journalism, though they have the problems there also, because first of all, it's unverified in many cases. And also, still with all the technology, there's many places around the world that people don't have smartphones, they don't have technology. This is why we at Videra are trying to go to places where media can't or won't go and build undercover sustainable network of people that can give us an ongoing flow of information from places usually we can't see images otherwise.
All right, so you say it's very useful. Claire, I know you're more skeptical about the role of citizen journalists.
Well, I'm very enthusiastic about new technology, and it's undoubtedly the case that having pictures and images instantaneously that you can see what happened, whether it's the Boston bombing or so on, is invaluable. But it's not journalism. That's my only point. Journalism is a lot more than just putting the camera and showing the pictures. It's developing context. It's being skeptical. It's being one of the awkward squad who asks awkward questions. There are standards involved. There is not taking at face value what you see. And I suppose I have a nervousness that, you know, just if you think you can understand a war by just seeing a bomb go off and lots of blood, it becomes actually, it's almost like a video game. You're kind of watching it, but you never understand anything. And it's whose blood? Why did the bomb go off? Who planted it? And the pictures don't tell you that. And similarly, or slightly differently, I think that journalists, mainstream journalism should hold its nerve. It has a responsibility for some kind of objective search for the truth, which I still think is an ideal worth holding on to. And I feel that they themselves are handing over the reins in a kind of craven, paranoid way to citizen journalists, saying, oh, maybe we don't know what we're doing at all, and you lot know better, and maybe we can ingratiate ourselves with the public by telling you how empowering this is. So I just think citizens with cameras, good, not journalism.
All right, Will Self, mainstream journalism should hold its nerve.
Well, I think it's already, you know, the horse's head has already been pulled from the Baltic, and we can see the eels struggling to exit its eye sockets. I mean, the revenue stream for mainstream news media is imperiled at the moment, and actually citizen journalism, I'm making quote marks if you can't see me, is coming in, to, as Claire has said, to fill this vacuum. So I'd rather take Claire's line. I think it's a mistake to even call it journalism. It's not what it is. Think of one of the most egregious examples recently, which was the use of chemical weapons in Syria, and there was an atrocity there that came to light in the form of smartphone journalism. It looked for a while as if this was actually going to trigger ground force invasion by the US of Syria. It now seems as if that attribution that the Bashar al-Assad regime was responsible for that attack was in fact not the case. So here you can see an example where, you know, decontextualized citizen journalism in some sense could have precipitated a human rights violation on a gargantuan scale. So, you know, I'm very skeptical actually of the value of this kind of footage.
All right, Paul, you were actually in Syria as a photographer there. You presumably worked with citizen journalists. How useful were they, and how, you know, easy or difficult was it to believe what they were telling you or showing you?
It made, I mean, I'll start off with, you know, Marie's whole philosophy, her reason was to bear witness. And, you know, that's what drove her. That's what drove both of us, really. So we got into Syria. You know, it was a room full of people with wires everywhere. Extremely brave people who were going out and filming, and every day some of them be killed, and they were getting fewer and fewer. So there was no doubt in their bravery. But being alongside them, we relied on them for safety, food, shelter, which made the job twice as difficult.
So they were your protection?
They were our protection, but we could never take what they said without actually, you know, we wouldn't dream of printing hearsay. We would go to the spot, and that's where I think professional journalists come into their own. They go further, and Marie was incredible at going one step further, one step further, one step further, till we really both realized we got the end of the line, and this was, in fact, as near to truth as we could work out, you know, whereas most people had kind of taken a picture, it was on YouTube instantly, and there was never that depth. No. And, you know, I mean, I could sit on YouTube, give me 20 minutes with an edit suite, and I can tell you any story you like. Yeah. Taking that footage, I can tell you anything.
Which is quite alarming. Simon,
I'm really good at
it. Simon in New York. Now, you obviously, I've seen your work for Vice TV in Ukraine, a very interesting development in journalism in itself. But were you using or relying on citizen journalists when you were there?
In Ukraine, what's happened over the last couple of months is that they've, as you probably know, been taking over a lot of administration buildings, a lot of government facilities, even military bases on both sides, from the Ukrainian side in Kyiv, in the capital, and from the pro-Russia side in eastern Ukraine. And what's developed is that a lot of people have started setting up live stream webcams outside of these buildings where permanent occupations are taking place. And those have been really useful to pretty much everyone who's following what's going on there, to know what's going on all of the time, because these live streams, they can run for days, or they switch them on when there's something happening outside of the building. But I wouldn't really call them journalism as much as activism, because, you know, a live stream set up in front of the occupied administration building in eastern Ukraine, in Donetsk, for example, will be used by the pro-Russia activists in order to know whether they need more people to come out in front of the protest in the building. Or, you know, in Kyiv, it'd be the same thing for the pro-Ukraine protesters. So they kind of use it for coordination, but us journalists can follow the cameras that have been set up all over the country to know what's going on where.
Okay, Simon, thank you for that. This is the point where we can open up the debate. People from the audience can ask their questions, and as I say, just raise your arm and someone will appear with a microphone and just stand up, and we don't need your name or life stories or anything like that. If you're online, post your comments and questions using that hashtag IQ2News. That's hashtag IQ2News. But to kickstart, we have a question from someone you may recognize in Los Angeles, and it's not Piers Morgan.
Hi, everybody. I'm Larry Keegan. I wish I could be there with you this evening, but since I can't, I have a couple of questions for the panel. First, How is eyewitness and amateur journalism changing the shape of news and affecting, for better or for worse, the work of the mainstream media? Second, are citizen reporters now vital members of the news industry, or are they simply karaoke journalists? Hey, I'll look forward to hearing your answers, and I wish you all the best.
Well, there are karaoke journalism, says Larry King. What do you make of that, Will Self?
Well, I think the best definition of journalism I ever heard was H.L. Mencken's, and he said that journalism exists to afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. And certainly as a journalist, that's my watchword. And if you think about that definition, it does cover all the bases. But it also says something about the relationship between objectivity and neutrality as well. We're very used to this line beginning to be blurred, and people have already talked about it, smartphone journalism really being activism. But what I think we need to understand here is that the job of the journalist is, yes, as Mary and Paul have done, to bear witness, but it's up to us to do what we will with what they bear witness about. If we tell people what to do, then that is propaganda. It's not actually journalism. It's propaganda of one kind or another. Now, let's take the attack on Lee Rigby, which was a very good example of this British soldier. These men stop him and attack him in the street. I saw that footage as it appeared on. Now, when I see anything in journalism, it was very shocking footage. It was happening virtually live. When you see anything like that, run the Mencken test. Is it afflicting the comfortable and comforting the afflicted? If it is comforting the afflicted, i.e. people who are disempowered in society, either economically, politically, or socially, then in that case, it can only be comforting them in the form of a rather grotesque form of entertainment. Ooh, look at that. We can now see a man who's just tried to hack off another man's head live on telly. Isn't that exciting? And I have to say, I think there is a frisson that lies behind a lot of this smartphone footage that is just that, a form of comfort that I don't think responsible journalism, if comfort is, should be involved in. Second point, does it afflict the comfortable, as an example of journalism? In other words, does the ability that the news media in theory now have to draw on this very wide pool of instantaneous imagery, is it being used to present information in such a way that it challenges vested interests? And again, I'm afraid a lot of this smartphone journalism doesn't really pass that test either.
All right, we can now introduce Jessica Mabry from Goa in India. There was a monsoon, I think, or it's just the beginning of the monsoon season, so we lost contact with
the first day of the monsoons today, so the power's been out until about 3 minutes ago.
All right, well, look, we're glad to have you. I just want to ask you, where does journalism end and activism start? Because I suppose you could be described as an activist rather than a journalist.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a real continuum between the two and that they go hand in hand. What we talk about is video for change. We have this very large network of what we call community correspondents, people from the most marginalized backgrounds in India who work as reporters, but they don't just make the videos, they then use them to try to solve the problem that the video addresses. So I think that the two go very well hand in hand. I mean, that in our own people can be journalists for most of what they do, but when they see an opportunity to use that video to solve the problem, they will seize it. And they, and the reason that they do that is because they see so much that's what the people in their communities want. The sense of voicelessness and marginalization is really there. They don't feel represented by the mainstream media.
Yeah, well, it's a good point, isn't it, that, Claire, that the citizen journalism can cover stories that mainstream media are just not interested in.
Well, there's two aspects to it. I mean, I've been involved in politics most of my life as an activist, and I'm certainly not opposed to political activists using the media to get their message out. But that's not what we're talking about. That's not journalism. That's activism. And activists will do whatever they will to propagandize, to polemicize, to argue, and good on them, right?
But journalists could use the material of activists quite...
They could, but they've got to know it's activist advocacy material, and therefore it doesn't necessarily hold up to strenuous examination in terms of a sense of how does this fit into the context? So you have to say that. I mean, the other thing is that this tendency has led to some real distortions, because you get people who, there's examples of people adding smoke to videos to, as they say, embellish the urgency of why we need to intervene for the greater truth. Even things like and so you have to remember that this sense of an attached activist journalism actually doesn't necessarily give you the truth. And what I'm saying is we should at least aspire to the truth.
Well, that's
the
the point,
activists actually won't know what to be active about, actually, unless somebody finds out what the truth is either.
Well, that's the point for you, isn't it? Because this whole question of verification is key.
First of all, I want to say that we kind of a bit get stuck in the definition of journalism, and a definition is general. I don't know if you saw Fox News lately. There's agenda there. The Guardian have agenda. Everybody have agenda, and kind of you can debate the kind of their currency sometimes and how verified the information is. Now, I think the way that we see news today is going to change. I think the whole landscape is shifting completely. I think journalism is going to look completely different. You have to make sure you verify the information, that you have a currency, that you be aware of people having an agenda. And that, we're working with activists across the world that definitely have agenda, but then you're working with a variety of groups that have different agenda and compare them and give it to the journalists and then verify it. Okay, do your own testing. So,
but I mean, we were laughing earlier, Paul was saying, but I mean, how easy is it now to, Photoshop or whatever you call this stuff and change it and add smoke and add gunfire and
I mean, it's easy. And I mean,
change the date on a...
To be really honest, you pick that camera up, you look back to the last, 90 years, the great photographs that stand out in people's memory are not disemboweled bodies or people with their heads chopped off. They're iconic images, the vulture with the starving child. That
napalm and kid running along the road.
Absolutely. And that isn't what happens with a smartphone. People will see someone running around burning and just film it, and that's kind of it. In a way, it's a bit like war porn. It's put on YouTube, and you can watch someone have their head sawed off with a rusty blade, whatever. I mean, it's my job to be there. When the shit hits the fan and everything goes ballistic, at that point in time, you've got to be able to get the camera, focus, look at it, think about it from an editorial point of view, i.e., will they use it? You've got to tell the story, you've got to capture it, and then you combine it with 2,500 words by an experienced journalist like Marie Colvin. The sum is greater than the two parts, and I think that's journalism.
I think it's monsoon paint.
I think that's my head.
I don't know what it is. But Charlene, what questions are we getting online?
We're getting a lot of questions in at the moment. Thank you to everyone who's been Facebooking and tweeting over the last 20 minutes or so. I've got a question here from Joshua Swain, who's in London, who says, do or should news agencies take a different view to editing or censoring material gathered from citizen journalists? I'd agree with Claire and be worried that citizen journalism could never tell more than one side of the story. Simon, in terms of what you were talking about regarding Ukraine, that's an interesting question, because is it possible to get both sides of the story from citizen journalists or activists?
I think the issue of verification is pretty important. You never know what you're looking at, really, when you see something on the internet. So, I mean, for my work, what we've been using it for mostly is taking our cues for what's going on when we see something on a live stream, for example, and then going down there and checking it out ourselves. And we only use the actual, live stream footage or smartphone footage if it's the only shot available that documents something that happened and it's, key to a story that we're working on. But we'll never try to, base an entire story on unverified footage. I think that's very important to do, is to go back and check and go to the places where it was shot and try to make sure that it actually represents what it's saying that it's shown.
Well, it seems to be a question which seems to be repeated actually online, Mark. So I have another question from Manushka Mujtaba, who says, how do you verify a citizen journalist? Journalists have to verify sources. Is the criteria the same? I saw you were nodding your head there.
Well, I just want to interrupt actually slightly, because here, Tim Singleton is here. If someone could give him a microphone, and he is the Director of News Gathering at ITV News and was foreign editor for a considerable time. And I know has dealt with pictures and material coming in from sources that we can't confirm. I mean, for instance, the material that we'll be receiving from Syria during the chemical attack time and all that material, how do you go about deciding what we should broadcast as part of our coverage and what we shouldn't?
Well, it's getting more difficult over time. I mean, there are different shades of grey here. You know, if a plane crashed outside this church now, God forbid, it'd be pretty easy to verify it. You know, big events happen and people are taking pictures of it. I think conflicts like Syria, where access for independent journalists becomes increasingly difficult, especially in the last 12 months, almost impossible, especially from the West. How then do you verify it? When it's hard to get meaningful contacts, you're not trusted by anyone because we're from a part of the world where we're not welcome in Syria. I mean, how do you go about doing that? It's the biggest problem we face at the minute. And it's magnified. In a sense, we've always needed citizen journalists. When we've been out, you know, fixers, as we would call them, in the field, translators, whatever, we've always used citizen journalists. But now they're empowered with the means of delivery of material to you, which completely changes the context of things. You mentioned people setting fire to, well, the ones I've seen, I think a Channel 4 programme exposed it, where they'd set fire to tyres and to put the smoke up and then claimed it was an attack and shot it in a way that didn't show the tyres. There's all different ways of manipulating things. So
but you see, there's a temptation, isn't there, probably to use it if it's really good, and then say in the intro or something, we can't verify this material.
Which can be a bit of a cop-out. Yeah, it can be a bit of a
and I'm sure it is used as a cop-out.
I think the moment people see unverified on the screen, I've spoken to people today about it, they just switch off.
But you see, the problem is the impact that could have. These sort of pictures can start wars.
Yeah, but it's also not pictures. I mean, you know, it really struck me. We saw the Boston bombs. I mean, yes, there were people who were there who filmed the Boston bombs. But as you'll know, then on Twitter, other people are saying there's bomb going off all over Boston because there's smoke coming out, and then so this gets repeated, let alone the manhunt, at which mainstream media almost followed Twitter, and apparently, you know, eyewitness, on the ground, authentic material, which led to also, you know, people getting arrested who shouldn't have, being accused of being bombers, all sorts of confusion. So I think it's more than just you've got the footage. My concern is that mainstream media, as I said earlier on, kind of become slightly over-dependent on the social media sense and feel somehow that it's more authentic because it's coming from the people. That I think is really our problem. It's a kind of it's more than just you've got the film. It's a more existential crisis, as it were, as to what journalism is, and that's what I would urge us to kind of consider more seriously.
Does anybody in the audience have a question they'd like to put to the panel? Yeah, there's the lady here. Just wait for the microphone.
I don't think this is existential. Isn't this financial? This is about money and what's going to be paid for, who's going to get paid. You think citizen journalism isn't filling a gap because people aren't spending money on covering foreign news and...
Well, I mean, that is a danger. It's a genuine danger, isn't it? If we can't finance bureaus around the world and sending journalists around the world, citizen journalism is going to fill the gap.
No, I don't think it is. I disagree. I think, you know, I was lucky enough to work on the Sunday Times, and there was never, when a big story, 27 weeks in Libya, did the whole thing. There was never a question of money. It was like, you know, show up the airport, big bag of cash, and we plug it up. And
we work for Murdoch. Tim.
I mean, I think the question that raises is actually, I would say that mainstream media organisations are still committed to reporting the world, and actually, as people are more aware of the uncertainty of the accuracy of information on the internet, actually we're more important and as relevant than ever. And mainstream media organisations now have it's imperative that we continue to bear witness, to send, to have bureaus and to report from around the world, because we have to confront the fact that a lot of material on the internet isn't reliable.
I mean, I was talking to journalism students a few weeks ago, and the first question I got was, aren't you now, your half-hour program in the evening on terrestrial television, isn't it now redundant because it's all on Twitter and there's all the citizen journalism going on? And I made the point that it is, in many ways, we're more important now, not less important. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, and I think it very much depends how people will consume news in the future. And I bet that in 20 years, nobody's going to read, or people are going to read, but much less than today. And they're going to count on video, short videos, showing us what's happening. I think that is extremely important that we'll have a very good mainstream or traditional journalists that are doing the work correctly. I disagree that they are everywhere. Look what's happening in Kar, South Sudan. They are there, but after the event is happening, they're not there before to show us what's happening. And if they were there before, maybe we'll not see what we're seeing after. So there's still lack of coverage across many places in the world. And definitely when dramatic images or dramatic events emerge, then journalists flying in. Most of the time, after the events really already exploded.
It's a point, isn't it, Will Self, that stories that perhaps emerge on through citizen journalism do become big stories, and then the organisations do spend the money and do send because it's causing such a noise online.
Up to a point, Lord Copper. I mean, the fact of the matter is, and I think the woman there was right, of course it's money to a certain extent, and of course it's about revenue streams, but also there seems to be, with the new media, a kind of weird new febrile sense of how things develop in the world. We saw it in the Arab Spring, we saw it in the lead up to the Iranian elections, we've now seen it in the Ukraine. And there are some mainstream media sources and pundits who are quite keen to exploit this febrile mood. And what it amounts to, it's like a sort of perversion of the McLuhanite global village. The idea is because everybody's tweeting about everything and because everybody's sending in this smartphone material, we must do something and we can. It's this idea of empowerment. And actually, I think what it does is it creates an atmosphere of hysteria. If you like, there's the transmission country, there's eastern Ukraine now, and there's people sitting in London or New York or Beijing or wherever they are going, oh, that's dreadful. Oh, look at that footage. Oh, we really ought to be able to do something. But in fact, they're decoupled from their own political process and from their own forms of civic and communal action and activism that will enable them to affect that. So that, what does it do, all of that kind of brouhaha? What does it actually do or produce? And who gets to use this head of effectively useless steam that this kind of material generates?
Let's take a question.
Moving on from what Will just said, does smartphone journalism risk glamorizing violence? We were talking about war reporting, and that's a very specific category, but think about something like happy slapping, which would never have existed if there wasn't smartphone footage that could be put on YouTube. Are we creating a whole generation of people who want to be famous or infamous for some violent act?
Well, I mean, that definitely fits into the Warholian 15 minutes of fame. We know all about that. But just to tell you something, because you're nice and young, people who are a bit older here may remember, and I remember this from my childhood, when TV cameras and the ability to send back instant film footage from conflict situations first began to happen, and it was the Vietnam War, unmediated footage went onto the TV screen in the evenings. And anybody who's, older than 50 will remember seeing stuff on mainstream news that would be unthinkable now. It took a while for news media to understand what a responsible relationship with that kind of footage was, and then it was developed. We're currently in an inchoate situation. And yes, I mean, I hate to sound kind of big brotherish, but it is the responsibility of mainstream news media to try and develop a way of dealing with that material and developing an ethic around it.
Sure. Jessica, you were waving. What was the point you wanted to make?
We're talking here as if citizen journalism is only the cell phone footage that comes through, right? It's only accidental video, it's only witnessing video. But I think, if we can take a longer term perspective, and there are other questions like, why are we just using the raw footage? What about the voices of, that people are using? I mean, how come you so rarely see citizen journalism of actually hearing people from these countries speaking out, and even less so, do you see news agencies giving a space for people to actually tell the entire report, to get their 3 minutes onto CNN and onto these different channels? And I think that's, to me, that's where it may be 20 years from now. And then we ask we ask the question, like, what's the role of subjective personal experience? It's definitely not, it's not journalism in the way that we're talking about here, but it's an important ancillary, and it's one of the things that technology has enabled. It's the field is changing. Technology is always changing, whether it's photography or it's print. It's every time there's a new technology, it pushes the boundaries, and I think it's a real opportunity. What citizen journalism presents, a real opportunity to start to change, a lot of things.
Okay, Jessica, thanks very much. I just want to take the question here from the gentleman. Sorry.
I would just like to say, that the Arab uprisings were kind of the source or the trigger for this debate. I don't think the debate can be constructive enough without considering the voices of the Arab activists or the Arab journalists, citizen journalists. So I wonder why there's no kind of an Arab activist part of the Arab uprising giving his say on this in this debate. Thank you.
Or maybe it just fits into what I was going to say, which is, in a way, that's what my nervousness is, because you could say, well, if we had an Arab activist here, that would represent all Arab activists everywhere. I mean, we only have to look at what's happened in Egypt to indicate that, the Arab Spring, the enthusiasm around the Arab Spring has turned into, and what's happened in Egypt has turned into a very vicious, bloody situation, military coups and so on. Which Arab activist? That would be the question.
Okay, well,
and then which footage did you listen to? Was it only those, by the way, who speak in English? That this can be manipulated, this can be used. So all I'm arguing for is not to be oversimplistic. It's a very attractive idea, isn't it? The voices that were previously not heard can now be heard. Sometimes that sounds great, but it just seems to me to be hopeless. It's just a rabble of voices, unless we understand why we're listening to them and what they mean in a particular context.
We do have a pre-recorded. It's not important. It's important to hear voices not heard. The question is what you're doing with them, how you verify them, how you put them in the right context, how you using them to kind of enrich in the way we are.
I don't want to silence anyone, but I'm also I don't want to be sentimental. It's a bit like blogging, right? There can be millions of people now free to blog, and that's brilliant. I'm not trying to censor them. But I do think that there is some responsibility to say that person has just written a blog and it's rubbish and they're not saying anything. And that is distinct from a very fine, well-executed, well-written article.
Right, we have a pre-recorded question.
Just a quick one on that. I don't know. I've got a metal plate, maybe it goes clean. But,
do you want to have a think about it?
No, it just sits out my head. I'm getting a little...
We have a pre-recorded question. We have a pre-recorded question from a citizen journalist in New York, and his name is Nathan Grant.
Hey everyone, my name is Nathan Grant, and as a citizen journalist, I provided live stream coverage of street protests, such as Occupy Wall Street, for 2 years. Now, because independent journalists are more able to adapt to the ever-changing means by which people consume their news, will it be through citizen journalism, then, that new and exciting means of news gathering are developed? Basically, can citizen journalism inspire more mainstream outlets to give up their more antiquated means of reporting news?
So there's a question, can citizen journalism get mainstream journalism into shape?
Definitely yes. I think it's kind of it's challenging mainstream journalism, and that's why reporter and mainstream journalists have to kind of shape up and make sure that they know exactly what they're doing and how they're covering the whole voices. I think we're a bit tired also of journalists flying into a place, standing in the wind, reporting about what's happening and going out. We want this voice also, but we want another voice in the circle to be gathered and to present it. So definitely it's challenging them.
Do you remember? I would disagree with that. Parachutes within, I think.
Not everybody, sorry, don't get me wrong.
Responsible journalists,
of course,
spend a long time
100%.
Information. What I was going to say before that slipped through was Channel 4, Jonathan Miller made a fantastic documentary, Inside Syria's Torture Machine. where they forensically examined every single piece of footage. They got language experts in, clinical people to look at the wounds, to listen to the dialects. And that was an incredibly huge and complex task to verify that footage. And to me, that is journalism. That is taking it apart, looking at it, and not just kind of going, yeah, we'll stick it on with
the question, how many really doing it, and how many they're doing it across a lot of areas?
A lot of people do that and say that was actually
yeah, definitely. So this is the challenge that we have.
Yeah? I want to ask Simon, your Ukraine experience. To what extent do you think that citizen journalists who are sometimes, an extension of the armed conflict, to what extent do they endanger mainstream journalists?
Well, I mean, in terms of professionally, I don't think that they endanger them very much, because I think that the two can exist side by side and kind of even complement each other. But if you mean like in a purely physical sense, I think the citizen journalists are mostly endangering themselves. I mean, when I was being held in the basement of the security services building in Slavyansk in eastern Ukraine, I met a citizen journalist, a guy who'd set up a live stream across the street from the very building that we were being held in a week before. And the reason that he was taken by the pro-Russia militants was that they'd seen the live stream online and didn't want him running it. And so that he's just been released a couple of days ago, luckily, and just given a press conference about his experience in Kiev earlier today. But he spent 3 weeks compared to my 3 days, because he wasn't known by anyone. He didn't represent any company. He just put his stuff on a live stream website, and they knew that they could hold him and nobody would really care. Luckily, though, he's out now.
Thanks for that, Simon. Charlene, are we getting some more questions?
Lots, actually. I'm going to put this question to, hang on, the one that I actually wanted to get to is from Hael Wartenberg, who's in Ghana. He says, is it fair to diminish smartphone journalism? The best journalism gives audiences stories, and smartphones afford all of us the ability to spread stories. Probably a good one for you, Claire.
As I've tried to indicate, first of all, I've got no objection to people using smartphones to tell stories. That's fine. But I thought it was interesting, the accusation of the kind of flying in, whereas there are these people embedded who live there, who know what's going on. But there's something about the flying in analogy that actually I want to hold on to, because it's called being disinterested, being outside of the main story. You're not a participant in the story. You're there and sometimes people will say, isn't it inhuman that journalists can watch these terrible things, children dying, and not get involved? But their job, a very specific job, which I could never do, is to actually have that objective, slightly cynical, slightly skeptical view. So it's not that they don't understand anything about the region. They're experts who, in a way, are outside of the situation. So if you're there on the ground telling stories with your smartphone, that's a very nice thing to do with your life.
Yeah.
But we actually, in serious terms, do need to understand we live in a serious times. And I need to know that there are some people who are dedicated to trying to get to what's going on and why, and what lies behind the surface of things, not the eyewitness or the activist. They are political jobs somewhere else. But journalism's got a very important role, and I worry that it needs to take itself more seriously. It's more important today than ever before, and therefore shouldn't worry too much. Just one tiny thing is this idea, as well as citizen journalists should tell about the news that the mainstream news won't tell, right? Some of this think about what this can mean. It drives me mad when you get those things that flash up on the news, which says, email in the news that matters to you. I mean, you do think the one group of people you don't ask what the news should be is me. I don't know, right? What I know is what I know, and therefore it's not going to be new to me. What I want is somebody to say to me, you think it's really boring to find out what's happening in Ukraine. It's got no relevance to you whatsoever. You don't think it's important, but I'm going to bash you over the head with why it's important. That's why they're in the news. They shouldn't court popularity, but they should convince us of why it's important, not give us what we want. We don't need to be pandered to in that way.
Yeah. I follow up with Claire on that one. When we were in Homs, we were in a media centre with a lot of guys sitting there, they were Skype and to Al Jazeera, all over the world. And this has gone on for 28 days of incredibly horrible shelling of just civilians, you know, and it was the most disgusting thing I've ever witnessed. That media centre operated for a long time. Marie went on the news one night, Channel 4, BBC, and CNN. The next morning, 4 rockets took out the media centre. And, you know, I mean, it's almost without doubt that because she was Marie, because people trusted that, you know, it rattled too many cages in Damascus, and they just said, take it
So
out.
the authorities knew where you were broadcasting from.
Absolutely, and I think in many ways they'd allowed a constant flow of media to be uploaded because it caused confusion. You know, the more material it is, the more confused people get.
That question from the gentleman up there who's been very patient.
Good evening, thank you. Doesn't successful journalism actually being made up of 2 parts? First is the collection of the data, and then secondly, the interpretation and verification of that data, or that journalism, or that news, or whatever it happens to be. Citizen journalism really deals with the collection part. And the reason that I don't get my news from YouTube is because there isn't any interpretation or verification. I do get it from ITV, and I don't get it from Russia Today. What does the panel think about that?
It's a good point, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. I think we're putting in the same basket variety of means of reporting and variety of kind of, you know, people filming their dog being drowned somewhere and people being bombed. So it kind of, we're generalizing, we're making a whole generalization about a lot of citizen journalism. There are some that are very important and very crucial, and you cannot get the information without activists on the ground filming, risking their life. And definitely great journalists should take these materials and work with it, verify it, make it part of the story. So it's just how you combine both together and how you're looking at it. You cannot ignore this in journalism and dismiss it, but you have to be very articulate about the way you use it and make sure that it's reaching the picture that we're telling to the world.
I think just for the final part of the debate, I think we want to know from each of the panel where journalism will be in, say, 10 years' time, where the convergence will be maybe between citizen journalism and mainstream journalism. I just wonder what you think of that. Will Self first.
Well, I mean, it's a question of revenue. It is a question, follow the money. It's a question of revenue streams. Terrestrial television, broadcast and print media are all suffering from the problem of the relationship between what they provide and what they're paid for. That simple relationship is really, you know, a debatable area at the moment. It's debatable land. I'm confident, and I hate agreeing with Claire, but I'm going to have to. It is a question of nerve on the part of mainstream media, on keeping nerve. And I think it is rather woeful, this, you know, I totally take on board what you're saying, but what we see in mainstream media at the moment is actually quite supine in relation to citizen journalism. It isn't actually policing it in the correct kind of way. But if I could just say something further, on the activist issue and on the kind of appeal to kind of sensibility. Oh, if there weren't people there with smartphones filming this stuff going on, how would we know about it? How could we do anything about it? Okay, what would it be like? All those voices are heard. You know, we live in a society in which there are very few taboos anymore about the portrayal of sex and violence. If you go back 40 or 50 years, there was an astonishingly governed public space. Everybody can be heard, actually, now. Nobody's listening, though.
There's too much of it.
There's too much of it. So what would it be like if all of those Indian activists out there, you know, in the region were all heard in some sense? Well, the answer is to have a society in which everything was heard by everybody would, of course, be a kind of anarcho-communistic society with devolved power. So that's the kind of paradigm. The idea of a fully functioning citizen journalist culture is a utopia.
Simon Ostrovsky, if I could come to you. You are breaking new ground in some respects in the way you cover news and the way you do news. Where do you think, where do you think journalism and citizen journalism will be in 10 years' time?
Well, I look forward to to everything evening out, so where we'll not have to carry around big, heavy cameras and be very obvious, and where we'll be able to film all of our reports on phones, and therefore we'll kind of be on an even playing field with everybody else. And then the people who will stand out are the ones who put their content together better in a more interesting and in a more informative way, but with the same tools that everybody can afford.
Okay, Simon, thanks very much. Claire, 10 years' time, where will we be?
Well, I find it extraordinary that on journalism courses at the moment at universities, they're teaching citizen journalism, which seems to be so oxymoronic it's untrue. But it seems to me that journalism is trying to ape citizen journalism too much, and that worries me. An analogy maybe is it drives me mad that you know, newspapers and editors seem to imagine that they can see the quality of a newspaper article by how often it's retweeted or how many comments there are at the bottom of it. I mean, this is what I mean about a kind of collapse of editorial confidence and the ability to be able to say that's an important piece of journalism and nobody's retweeted it and no one's written a comment, but that's not the way things are going. That worries me. And just one thing is I'm not complacent about mainstream journalism, by the way. I was all ready to say eyewitnesses aren't, you know, if you think about Jean-Charles de Menier and the eyewitness accounts, he was wearing a bulky jacket, he ran over the, you know, he jumped, and of course it wasn't true, but loads of people saw it. So eyewitness we have to be careful about. But then I also remember the toppling of the Saddam Hussein statue, and we were given the impression that that was the masses and it was the end of the Iraq War. And that was mainstream media that sold us that pop. So we should be on our guard as citizens to ensure that journalism doesn't lower its standards. Rather than thinking that we are the journalists, we should hold journalists to very high journalistic standards and absolutely do them over if they try and sell us anything other than the best of the truth.
Oren.
I definitely agree with you. I do think that in Videra we offer an interesting solution for citizen journalism. We are not just collecting information from out there. It's not about crowdsourcing, about targeted areas, building network, training people, making sure that there is common of a standard, collecting information, verified, and engaging to the news. Some kind of interesting combination between traditional media and new source of citizen journalism. Yeah. So I think finding the right solution, understanding there is, you know, people coming with all kind of agendas and objectives, but finding the right balance in between using them and also using traditional media in the right way.
We've got to take Jessica next. Jessica, we've lost Jessica, I'm told, so I'm too late. The monsoon is back. So over to you, Paul.
It's just on that point about training citizen journalists. That's very difficult in a war zone. You know, so when it kicks off, you know, you just think, what do we do? Hope that that's the region where we train people. You know, you can't run around homes going, this is like, do it this way. It doesn't happen. Them guys go out there, they do it. They're brave. They get the pictures. But it's difficult. How do you train the whole world to be a responsible journalist and not just a taking pictures?
Actually, because you're talking about the future of journalism, I'll just pop one of the questions that we've had on Twitter from Tini Gua Roy, who's in London. He says, how does the panel feel about sites like BuzzFeed moving into breaking news based on content from smartphone journalists? Is this the future?
Yeah,
unfortunately,
not. But just
Oren disagrees. Oren says yes.
Could I make a point here about this, which I think has been slightly overlooked? What is the platform for all of this? The smartphone. The smartphone isn't a value-neutral object. It's often on a contract. It's owned by a corporation. It has an operating system. It comes with an awful lot of, you know, when people go to meet, God, my mind's gone blank, the guy who blew the whistle on Prism, the whistleblower on the... When people went to meet him, journalists went to meet him, he said to them, switch those smartphones off, don't you realize they can be used as recorders? So, you know, the idea that the smartphone is an empowering device, it's got a long trail. And the other thing is, back to the medium is the message. News tends to be perceived in the context of the smartphone as on a par with other smartphone-y type things. It's like an app, you know. Oh, I've got this kind of instant violence from the eastern Ukraine app. You know, it'll come. No, I mean, you can laugh about it, but there's a flattening of sensibility there.
But
you know.
if we turn sort of the whole in terms of those specific websites like BuzzFeed, for example, I mean, Oren, do you feel that this could be the future in terms of sites like this that are only doing breaking news based on generated footage?
I guess for a lot of audience, yes. Very much depends, who is the audience and how you're getting your information. I believe, people are going to continue reading the New York Times and others. And I hope
that's the happy slapping of news. It's what this young woman raised.
You have a site like Vice, for which Simon writes for, which is hugely popular, but you wouldn't find, the New York Times readers, for example, wouldn't necessarily automatically go to Vice. But it doesn't devalue what someone like Simon does.
I know, but this is, first of all, I don't want to start a moral panic about mobile phone technology. I can also Skype my mum on it. I can send her films. I mean, I think being able to take films is a great thing, and the technology is exciting and so on. But, it's just technology, for good or bad. The thing that worries me is I really don't. I mean, people will try and find new ways of doing news coverage, and that's fine. And no one should panic about that. But what BuzzFeed is saying is not news coverage. And it's really interesting because BuzzFeed, just before Christmas, actually their new arts editor, came out and said, we don't want any negative reviews of any arts productions. We've decided we only want positive feedback on any arts productions. I call that PR. Right? So if BuzzFeed do good arts
but the reality...
But there's another point here. There's another point here that in some countries, in too many countries around the world, journalists cannot operate. Journalists get locked up, journalists get killed, journalists get targeted. And in those countries, surely, citizen journalism is often the only outlet. I mean, in too many countries around the world where there is no mainstream journalism doesn't exist. Yep. You had a question.
Do you think that moving into like a digital revolution where we've got access to the internet and access for people to upload news and as soon as they take it, do you think that reputation is something that's going to play a part? Within the digital world, you have things like LinkedIn, where people's personal reputations can be shown online, so you can see some sort of insight into who they are and what they do or stand for.
Is that what LinkedIn's about? I constantly get these emails saying, Claire Fox would like you to join her LinkedIn partnership.
That is a libelous statement,
I instantly delete them.
Right, we've got 1 minute. Who wants to take the question?
I just think, consider Wikipedia. I think it's got 21 million editors. You must Google me when you get home and look at Wikipedia. All I can say is it is not a reliable source of information, and my reputation will suffer badly by asking you to Google about me. I mean, hopefully you can Google me and see that there's an awful lot of rubbish written about, not about me or anyone. A lot of rubbish, yeah, I mean... Yeah, you won't necessarily get the truth, is the point that I'm making.
Could I just pick up on the point that it was raised very briefly? And without being, again, kind of starry-eyed about this, suppose you're in Myanmar, or it's meant to be open more now, but you're in a closed country where you can't get authentic news. But there are citizen journalists operating. Where is their information going to? And again, it's not authenticated. So how is it empowering the people in the closed country? Actually, people behind the Iron Curtain during the Cold War listened to the World Service if they wanted to know what was going on in Poland or, wherever. So the idea that citizen journalism in some way is going to help the oppressed in this, I think is a bit dubious.
But I will jump in because this is part of our work. It does help because you have to understand what the theory of change, what you want to achieve. It's going to be a social change on the ground. They're going to use it for their own campaigns inside. It's going to be international media. Is it going to be to court cases? It's going to be images that are going to be there?
It's often been done to lobby mainstream media in the West to do something, which is advocacy, not journalism.
Claire, thank you very much indeed. That is it. That's all we have time for. News at 10 starts in 2 hours. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for being here and contributing. Thanks to our panel, Will Self, Paul Conroy, Oren Yakovovich, Claire Fox.
Thank you.
And Simon, thank you very much to you there in New York, and Jessica, wherever you are, thank you very much. Thanks to Intelligence Squared, Thanks to Google for making the event possible. The debate is over. Discussion can continue online. Charlene is here for another 14 hours. Do continue to share your thoughts with us. But from me, Mark Austin, from everyone here, thank you very much. Good night.